From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Human Rights Watch conducted in-depth investigations into 3 Israeli strikes that killed 62 Palestinian civilians and involved serious violations of the laws of war and apparent war crimes.
Human Rights Watch is calling on the International Criminal Court to open a war crimes probe of Israel over its assault on Gaza, which killed 260 Palestinians, including 66 children. We'll air a disturbing video report documenting the group's findings. Plus, we look at the fallout from Ben & Jerry's decision to halt ice cream sales in Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank. The Israeli government claims the move is anti-Semitic and wants the company prosecuted in the U.S. under anti-boycott laws. But many Jewish groups, including J Street, support Ben & Jerry's decision.
We've been, outraged and appalled, frankly, by the over-the-top aggressive attacks on Ben & Jerry's.
Plus, we go to Guatemala, where thousands took to the streets Thursday for a national strike demanding the resignation of right-wing President Alejandro Giammattei.
We are sick and tired of living in this situation. Starting today, we are not going to let this corrupt government rest. Starting today, the people have to be more united than ever because we must stop this injustice.
The protests in Guatemala follow the ouster of the nation's top anti-corruption prosecutor, who was then forced to flee Guatemala in fear for his life. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Biden's announced new requirements for civilian federal employees amidst the surge in COVID-19 cases from the rapidly spreading Delta variant.
Every federal government employee will be asked to attest to their vaccination status. Anyone who does not attest or is not vaccinated will be required to mask no matter where they work, test 1 or 2 times a week to see if they've acquired COVID, socially distance, and generally will not be allowed to travel for work.
President Biden also directed the Pentagon to work towards a vaccine mandate for all military members and called on states and local governments to use federal funding they receive to offer a $100 incentive for vaccinations. New York City is launching that initiative today. Meanwhile, Washington, D.C. is the latest area to reinstate an indoor mask mandate for all. According to an internal CDC report, infections of the Delta variant could be just as transmissible from breakthrough infections in vaccinated people as from the unvaccinated, and could be more severe, with each infected person able to infect 8 to 9 others. The document also said the Delta variant is as contagious as chickenpox and more contagious than the viruses that cause the common cold, the seasonal flu, and other easily transmitted illnesses. The House is expected to consider a bill today which would extend a nationwide moratorium on evictions set to expire tomorrow, Saturday, as nearly 12 million people in the U.S. are behind on rent. On Thursday, Biden urged Congress to find a way to extend the ban since the CDC is no longer able to do so as a result of a Supreme Court ruling last month. Also, the European Union has surpassed the U.S. in inoculations. In international news, Britain's UN ambassador has warned that half of Burma's population of 54 million could contract COVID-19 in the next 2 weeks amidst the ongoing turmoil following the military coup in February. Pakistan is enacting an air travel ban for anyone who cannot provide a vaccine certificate. It's also mandating all public sector workers get vaccinated, as well as public transport and retail staff and teachers and students 18 and older. Meanwhile, record cases have been reported across Japan and in Tokyo this week as the Olympics continue. Israel said it'll be offering booster shots of the Pfizer vaccine to people over 60, the first country to do so. beyond the original 2-shot dose. This despite less than 10% of Palestinians in the occupied territories having been fully vaccinated. In Haiti, health workers say hospitals are becoming overwhelmed due to a surge in cases as Haiti grapples with a worsening economic and political crisis in the wake of the assassination of Haitian President Jovenel Moïse. This is hospital director Dr. Nathalie Colas.
Sometimes we have almost 60 patients at the hospital who need oxygen, while we only have 10 oxygen tanks available. The areas where we could get oxygen are inaccessible. It is a very stressful situation for us at the hospital.
Both the House and Senate passed a $2.1 billion emergency spending package for Capitol security in response to a funding crisis incurred by the January 6th insurrection. The measure also includes funds for resettling Afghans who worked with U.S. forces during the occupation of their country. The first evacuation flight for Afghan interpreters and others arrived at Washington Dulles Airport early this morning. A new watchdog report says over 80 Afghan troops were killed during the Taliban offensive this spring in more than 24 insider attacks as the U.S. withdrawal was underway. In yet other news from Afghanistan, at least 80 people have been killed in flash floods in a Taliban-controlled village in Nuristan province. Scientists warn extreme weather events will get worse due to the climate catastrophe. The United States is returning some 17,000 archaeological treasures to Iraq that were looted during the decades of war and U.S. occupation. Some of the artifacts date back 4,000 years. Baghdad's culture minister praised the move as an unprecedented restitution. The U.S. is reportedly planning to impose sanctions on Iran's drone and guided missile programs. This comes following reports the Biden administration is weighing tightening oil sanctions on Iran if talks to relaunch the nuclear deal, which the U.S. unilaterally withdrew from under Trump, fail. Iran has repeatedly said it will not recommit to the agreement until the U.S. lifts its devastating sanctions against Iran. In the occupied West Bank, Israeli forces shot dead a Palestinian man at a protest that took place during the funeral of a 12-year-old Palestinian boy killed by Israel just one day earlier. 20-year-old Shaka Khalid Awad reportedly died from gunshot wounds to the head and stomach. Israeli forces also fired tear gas, rubber-coated bullets, and stun grenades at the mourners. In Hong Kong, the first protester to be tried under a sweeping national security law was sentenced to 9 years for, quote, inciting terrorism and secessionism. Tong Ying Kit was arrested in 2020 while riding a motorbike and flying a flag with the slogan, "Liberate Hong Kong, Revolution of Our Times." Over 100 people have been arrested under the legislation following months of massive mobilizations in 2019. In climate news, researchers found Greenland lost 8.5 billion tons of surface mass due to ice melting over just one day this week, an event that's only happened 3 times in the last decade. That melt is large enough to cover the entire state of Florida in at least 2 inches of water. A Massachusetts court has charged Theodore McCarrick, the former Archbishop of Washington, D.C., with sexually assaulting a 16-year-old boy during a wedding reception in 1974. 91-year-old McCarrick, who was defrocked in 2019, is the highest-ranking Catholic official in the United States to face criminal charges for sex crimes. Massachusetts law stops the clock on the statute of limitations if someone accused of a crime leaves the state. Missouri Congressmember Cori Bush has introduced the Unhoused Bill of Rights. The bill would protect the human rights of unhoused people, including freedom from harassment by law enforcement. It would also work to permanently end the unhoused crisis by 2025 through increasing affordable housing, universal housing vouchers, and ensuring funding of essential social services and housing programs. This is Congressmember Bush.
I sit here today as a formerly unhoused Congress member. I am outraged. There is no reason we can fund wars and weapons, but we can't provide universal housing and health care. The urgency of this crisis has never been clearer as the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed just how many of our neighbors live one missed paycheck away from becoming unhoused.
In Brooklyn, New York, the mutual aid collective The Gym is speaking out after they were attacked at their storefront space in Bushwick by New York police over the weekend. 14 people were arrested, one person hospitalized, and others injured. New York officials have called for an investigation into the attack. Members of The Gym held a news conference earlier this week.
This community experienced a brutal crackdown by every force and tool of the NYPD against a community center and safe space. Sent by a millionaire landlord who wasn't here and doesn't live or have an office in the 5 boroughs, they spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on Saturday's violence, followed by a further 4+ days of round-the-clock surveillance. You can't stop us because we mean we will be here every day with our neighbors until the world's ample resources are freely available to all.
Meanwhile, in a separate incident, police arrested at least 11 people who shut down a lower Manhattan street in front of City Hall at a Housing Not Shelters demonstration Thursday. Housing rights advocates were calling out the city's plan to transfer thousands of unhoused people from hotels back to shelters where they face increased precarity and possible COVID exposure. Hundreds of striking Alabama coal miners traveled to New York City this week and held a protest in front of the offices of hedge fund BlackRock, the largest shareholder of Warrior Met Coal. Over 1,000 members of the United Mine Workers of America have been on strike since April 1st after rejecting a new contract that refused to restore their full pay after miners took a pay cut in 2016 to help keep the company afloat. Carl Levin, longtime liberal senator from Michigan, passed away at the age of 87. He was known for doggedly pursuing tax fraud and going after Wall Street's financial crimes. Levin also led opposition to the resolution that granted then-President George W. Bush authority to invade Iraq. And a 25-foot totem pole from the Lummi Nation arrived in Washington, D.C. after a more than 20,000-mile cross-country journey through sacred lands. Interior Secretary Deb Haaland and tribal leaders blessed the pole Thursday during a ceremony in the National Mall. It was carved from a 400-year-old red cedar tree and will serve to raise awareness of Native issues and protecting sacred sites. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Human Rights Watch is calling on the International Criminal Court to open a probe into apparent Israeli war crimes committed during its recent 11-day assault on Gaza that killed 260 Palestinians, including 66 children. Human Rights Watch concluded Israel had committed apparent war crimes after closely examining 3 Israeli strikes that killed 62 Palestinian civilians in May. U.S.-made weapons were used in at least 2 of the attacks investigated. Human Rights Watch released this video to accompany its new report. A warning to our audience, the video contains graphic content, including the sounds of military attacks on civilians.
On May 10, 2021, 11 days of hostilities began between the Israeli military and Palestinian armed groups, including Hamas, in the Gaza Strip and Israel. The fighting took place amid escalating repression in occupied East Jerusalem and the prolonged closure of the Gaza Strip. These policies and practices reflect the Israeli government's crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution. Human Rights Watch conducted in-depth investigations into 3 Israeli strikes that killed 62 Palestinian civilians and involved serious violations of the laws of war and apparent war crimes.
Human Rights Watch will be reporting in August 2021 on Palestinian armed group attacks that cost civilian casualties.
In the northeastern corner of the Gaza Strip outside Beit Hanun town, shortly after 6 p.m. on May 10, a guided missile struck near 4 houses belonging to the extended al-Masri family. Members of the family were packing processed barley for animal feed into sacks at the time.
My brother Ibrahim and I were around 150 to 200 meters away. When they struck our children, we were facing the events. We saw it with our own eyes. when they were hit. I ran to them right away. I found our children scattered. They were scattered on the floor, ripped to pieces, blood and brain fragments.
Israeli authorities have said that the attack involved a misfired Palestinian rocket coming from the west, but have produced no evidence to back up this claim. Witnesses saw a munition approaching them from the east, from Israel. Based on munition remnants found at the scene of the attack and witnesses' descriptions, we determined that the 6 children and 2 adults were most likely killed by a type of guided missile used to attack military vehicles or personnel in the open. 6 days after the attack, the Israeli authorities also included the photo of one man killed in the Beit Hanun attack on a list of militant group activists they said had been killed in unspecified locations. Human Rights Watch's interviews with witnesses who knew him indicate the man was a civilian. Our research uncovered no evidence of a military target at or near the site. We therefore found the attack to be unlawful.
It was a scene I could never expect. Everyone cries and screams every day. Do you know what my wife wants? She wants me to sell the house. She cannot accept how her children were all killed.
Al-Shati refugee camp, located northwest of Gaza City, is one of the most densely populated places in the world. At about 1:40 a.m. on May 15, an Israeli airstrike destroyed a 3-story building in the camp, killing 2 women and 8 of their children.
I lived with my wife and 5 children in the house. Our home was filled with love, peace, and happiness. We had been living here for 30 years. There was no prior notice, no phone call, no order to vacate. That night I went to buy bread for dinner. All of a sudden there were sounds of explosion in the area. I found that my own home had been struck.
The Israeli military said it struck the building because senior Hamas officials were there. It also separately said that they had targeted a bunker under or near the building. None of the witnesses Human Rights Watch interviewed were aware of any militants or other military targets in or near the building. The Israeli authorities have presented no such evidence.
I had a reality. I had a dream here. I had a family here. Now I have no family and no home. My only daughter and I are on the street. They destroyed everything in my life. They destroyed my life entirely.
At about 1 a.m. on May 16, the Israeli military launched a 4-minute attack in the heart of Gaza City along 5 streets, including Al-Wahda Street, causing 3 multi-story residential buildings to collapse.
Me, my father and mother, and my brother and sister, we started hearing the sound of loud explosions. After the second missile landed, the house started to sway right and left, as if it were about to fall down and collapse. I pulled my sister by the arm towards the hallway and held her in order to shield her. And suddenly, we saw the 3rd missile coming from the window, and the hallway's entire wall collapsed, and the whole floor suddenly disappeared, and everything fell on us. And afterwards, the 4th missile came down on us and destroyed everything.
Human Rights Watch determined that the 3 buildings collapsed after missiles struck the road or sidewalk next to the buildings. The Israeli military said that they targeted tunnels used by armed groups. Later, they said the attack had targeted an underground command center, but without providing any details or evidence.
Why did they kill my family? Why did they kill my mother and father? Why did they turn me into an orphan? Who will, in the end, give me justice?
The attacks killed 44 civilians, including 14 women, 12 men, and 18 children. It also injured about 50 others. The Israeli military used powerful weapons in a heavily populated residential area, putting the lives of scores of civilians at risk. Since then, they have produced no evidence of a military target in the vicinity to justify the attack. If there was a military target, they have also not shown that it was important enough to justify the risk to civilians. As a result, these attacks were unlawful. The UN says that Israeli airstrikes in May killed at least 129 civilians, including 66 children. The Israeli military said that Palestinian armed groups in Gaza fired more than 4,360 rockets and mortars towards Israel between May 10 and 21, resulting in 12 civilian deaths, including 2 children. Several Palestinians also died in Gaza when rockets fired by armed groups fell short and landed in Gaza. Rockets that Palestinian armed groups fire at Israel are inherently indiscriminate when directed towards areas with civilians. Their use in such circumstances violates the laws of war and amounts to war crimes. For years, Israeli and Palestinian authorities have systematically failed to credibly investigate alleged war crimes. The International Criminal Court prosecutor should investigate Israeli attacks in Gaza that evidently killed civilians unlawfully, rocket attacks by Palestinian armed groups against Israel that violate the laws of war, and other grave abuses, including the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution.
That new video produced by Human Rights Watch. The video was released along with a new report titled Gaza, Apparent War Crimes During May Fighting. We're joined now by Omar Shakir, Israel and Palestine Director at Human Rights Watch. He's joining us from Amman, Jordan. What were you most shocked by in these interviews and this investigation into what happened in Israel's last attack on Gaza?
Amy, some of the testimonies that we collected are among the most harrowing I've ever come across in my 4.5 years working on Israel-Palestine. You had strikes that wiped out entire families. You had cases where families were reduced from having 7, 8 kids to having one surviving member of their family. You had people's entire lives, their homes, their businesses, their wives, their children, their husbands, gone in a flash. And those testimonies are so important for us to discuss today because the international community focuses on Gaza maybe when there are armed hostilities. But 2 months later, these families continue to deal with the aftermath of the devastation wrought upon their lives. And it's critically important to them and to all victims of grave human rights abuse that there is accountability for these serious abuses and that steps are taken by the international community to prevent yet another cycle of bloodshed and repression. This wasn't the first, and it won't be the last unless we take grave, definitive action.
What has been the response of the Israeli government to your report, Omar, to Human Rights Watch report?
Human Rights Watch wrote to the Israeli government in June. We specified the strikes that we were looking into. We sent them a number of detailed questions. They replied to our letter saying that they were not obligated under Israeli law to answer our questions and providing a list of general assertions, stating, for example, that they took measures to minimize the impact from their strikes. That fault belongs to Hamas because, according to them, they fire from populated areas, and saying that, of course, they would investigate these strikes. But these are the same allegations. These are the same claims they trot out each time. They did so in 2008, in 2012, in 2014, in 2018, and 2019, and they're doing so again today. The reality is that there is a whitewash mechanism within Israel that ensures that these abuses are not investigated, that impunity is the norm. And that's why it's so important that the International Criminal Court include these attacks, as well as their larger context, including apartheid and persecution, in the formal probe that they are currently working on.
I wanted to ask you about the change in perception in the United States about what's happening with the Israeli government and the occupation. I remember that front page photo display. It was Friday, May 28th, and the headline was, "They were just children." And it shows scores of more than 65 children's faces in Gaza who died in the attack.
That sort of reporting should be the norm, Amy, and it's unfortunate that for too many years that has not been the case. You know, the reality here is, for too often, Palestinian deaths, when they're covered. I mean, just this week, as you mentioned, in the lead to the news program today, you had a 20-year-old Palestinian who was killed while in a protest over the killing of a 12-year-old, and an organization whose work is the Defense for Children International Palestine to document children's deaths had their offices raided this week by the Israeli army. You know, too often these sorts of events don't make the international news cycle. These sorts of events highlight the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution. There's certainly, Amy, growing awareness. I think that apartheid and persecution are the reality for millions of Palestinians. I think we saw a shift in the latest hostilities, including, members of the U.S. Congress who didn't just focus on the latest Palestinian rocket or Israeli airstrike, but looked at what they described as root causes of the conflict, looking at the larger context, the discriminatory treatment of Palestinians. That's so important because the first step to solving any problem is to diagnose it correctly. So recognition needs to happen, and then the action needs to be taken that's commiserate with that problem. In this case, ending complicity with grave crimes, as well as ensuring accountability for them.
You talked about the killing of the 12-year-old Palestinian boy. He was named Mohammed Al-Alami, sat in the backseat of his father's car at an Israeli checkpoint north of Hebron, the 11th Palestinian child killed by Israeli forces in the occupied West Bank this year. That's according to Defense for Children International, which publicized Mohammed's killing on Wednesday. Yesterday, Israeli forces raided the group's main office, seizing files about Palestinian children in Israeli detention. Can you comment on this?
Absolutely. Look, Amy, there has been a systematic assault on human rights advocacy, on the individuals and groups that are reporting, documenting, speaking out against the reality of Israeli repression. For international groups, that can take the form of denials of entry or deportation. For Israeli groups, it can be smear campaigns. But Palestinian groups face it the worst. This is not the only example of the army raiding a human rights organization. It happened a couple of years ago with the group Al-Damir. And it's not limited to that. As we speak, there are Palestinian human rights defenders that are sitting in an Israeli prison, over their activism and advocacy. There are Palestinian human rights defenders who face a travel ban, a punitive ban that seems linked to the work they do promoting awareness and calling for an end to Israeli repression. So it's important for the international community to speak out, to defend the space for human rights advocacy and human rights groups to operate, because if the international community cannot protect the space for human rights groups to report on human rights abuse, how are they ever going to stop human rights abuse in the first place? These are not one-offs. This is part of a systematic practice, and it must end.
Omar Shakir is Israel and Palestine director at Human Rights Watch. We'll link to your report, Gaza, Apparent War Crimes During May Fighting. And Omar, we're going to ask you to stay with us for our next segment as we look at the fallout from Ben & Jerry's decision to halt ice cream sales in Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank. The Israeli government claims the move is anti-Semitic, but many Jewish groups, including J Street, support Ben & Jerry's decision. Stay with us.
وصورة عليها ناس معلقين بخيط. هل كان عندهم بيت وصورة عليها ناس معلقين بخيط وقعوا عن سطوح العمر واستلقتوا الحجار وقعوا مثل ما بيوقع المشمش على لولاد الصغار. هل كان عندهم بيت وصورة عليها ناس.
Those Who Had a Home by Sabrine. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Israel's launched what has been described as a maximum pressure campaign against Ben & Jerry's and its parent company, Unilever, after the iconic ice cream brand announced it's halting sales in Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank. Israel's asked 35 U.S. governors to enforce state laws which make it a crime to support the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Movement, or BDS. Last week, the head of the New York State Common Retirement Fund wrote to Unilever saying it was examining whether Ben & Jerry's had violated state policy on Israeli boycotts. Meanwhile, Brad Lander, the Democratic nominee for New York City Comptroller, criticized the state's position, saying, quote, actions that erase the distinction between Israel and its settlements in occupied territory are effectively endorsing annexation and today's unjust one-state status quo, he said. The founders of Ben & Jerry's, who no longer have operational control of the company, have defended the company's decision. Writing in the New York Times in an op-ed, Ben Cohen and Jerry Greenfield describe themselves as proud Jews and supporters of the State of Israel. They write, quote, we believe this act can and should be seen as advancing the concepts of justice and human rights, core tenets of Judaism, they said. Meanwhile, a number of Jewish groups, including J Street and the New Israel Fund and Americans for Peace Now, all of whom oppose BDS, have defended Ben & Jerry's decision and rejected accusations that the company's decision was anti-Semitic. We're joined now by Logan Bayroff, the Vice President of Communications of J Street, and still with us, Omar Shakir, Israel and Palestine Director at Human Rights Watch. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Let's begin with Logan. Talk about this maximum pressure campaign the Israeli government is bringing and the response to it around the United States.
Well, yes, Amy, thanks for having me on, first of all. And I mean, what we're seeing is a aggressive, over-the-top, full-court press from senior officials in the Israeli government, also from some senior leaders in right-leaning American Jewish and pro-Israel groups in the United States to target Ben & Jerry's simply for the fact that they made a principled decision to respect the distinction between the state of Israel and the territory that it occupies beyond the Green Line, and made a principled decision that while they're going to continue to do business in Israel, they no longer want to sell their ice cream in settlements that are illegal under international law in territory that is occupied and where Palestinians face systemic injustice. And simply for making that principled decision, they're now facing calls to have constitutionally dubious anti-boycott laws deployed against them to potentially prevent them from doing business in states across the country, or to impose some sort of legal penalty or sanction on Ben & Jerry's or their parent company. They're facing, accusations, as you said, that they are somehow anti-Semitic, that they're somehow dehumanizing the Jewish people even, or in league with terror. I mean, completely over the top, frankly, insane accusations that I think are just designed to intimidate Ben & Jerry's and not just a major ice cream company, but all those, including many American Jews, who want to protest and speak out against the injustice of occupation, including groups like J Street that also consider ourselves to be pro-Israel, but also support and care about Palestinian rights and understand that the occupation needs to be called out and needs to end if we're going to end the conflict and create a better future for both peoples.
This is U.S. State Department spokesperson Ned Price responding to questions on Ben & Jerry's earlier in the week.
Well, I don't have a reaction to offer regarding the actions of a private company. But more broadly, what I will say is that we firmly reject the BDS movement, which unfairly singles out Israel. While the Biden-Harris administration will fully and always respect the First Amendment rights of our citizens, of the American people, the United States will be a strong partner in fighting efforts around the world that potentially seek to delegitimize Israel, and will work tirelessly to support Israel's further integration into the international community.
Logan Bayruff, if you can respond to Ned Price and also talk about the letter that your group, J Street, New Israel Fund and others have written to, 35 U.S. governors.
Well, what I would say is that it's, and I'll take those, they're sort of related. I think it's notable that the Israeli government has been writing to governors rather than to the federal government. There has been an effort going on for years, as you know, to pass and push these really insidious, constitutionally dubious anti-BDS laws at the state level. There's also been efforts at the federal level that groups like J Street and others in the American Jewish community and some in the pro-Israel community have advocated to block. We've said this legislation does not represent the majority of the American Jewish community, who thinks First Amendment rights are very important, who thinks that any form of boycott is protected political free speech that needs to be sacrosanct in this country, and who thinks that these attacks are dangerous and don't do anything to help American Jews or even in the long run to help Israel. We've succeeded in blocking those at the federal level, but they have passed at the state level. And that's why you have this effort to the governors to try to, sort of go around, the power of the president or the power of Congress to conduct foreign policy and to try to have state governments, intervening to punish companies or individuals because they want to speak out against the occupation or support Palestinian rights. And, that's what's going on here. And J Street has joined friend of the court briefs in a number of cases where these laws have been struck down. In places like Arkansas, in places like Georgia just this year, courts have found some of these laws unconstitutional. And yet many are still being passed. Many are still on the books. And you have this effort, these legal efforts moving forward to target Ben & Jerry's, I think, as a test case, again, to sort of intimidate and suppress other companies or individuals who might want to come out and say, we want to find a way to push back against what's happening in the occupied territory.
I want to bring Omar Shakir back into the conversation and get your response, Omar Shakir, with Human Rights Watch, based in Amman, Jordan, the Israel and Palestine director there. Axios had a very interesting piece on this maximum pressure campaign. They wrote, on July 22nd, the Israeli Foreign Ministry sent a classified cable to all Israeli diplomatic missions in North America and Europe, ordering them to start a pressure campaign against Ben & Jerry's and Unilever in order to convince them to negotiate. Israeli diplomats were instructed to encourage Jewish organizations, pro-Israel advocacy groups, and evangelical communities to organize demonstrations in front of Ben & Jerry's and Unilever offices and put pressure on investors and distributors for both companies. The foreign ministry also asked the diplomats to push for public statements condemning the companies and to encourage public protest in the media and directly with key executives in both companies. The diplomats were also instructed to echo those protests on social media for maximum flexibility. And this final example, the Israeli embassy in Washington and the Israeli consulates around the U.S. were asked to push for the activation of anti-BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions legislation in several states and to engage with governors, mayors, members of Congress, and state officials like attorneys general. Again, I was reading from Axios. Your response, Omar Shakir.
Amy, it's clear that they're trying to follow the Airbnb model. What I'm referencing here is when Airbnb made a decision a couple of years ago to stop listing in the occupied West Bank because doing so, made them complicit in serious human rights abuses. They undertook a similar strategy, and they eventually bullied Airbnb into caving. The difference here is that Ben & Jerry's is a deeply principled company with clearly articulated values and are acting pursuant to this. This is a company that at its core takes the principles of human rights and social justice seriously. The reality here, as Logan mentioned, is that settlements are illegal. They are war crimes under the Fourth Geneva Convention. And when businesses operate in the West Bank, they are directly benefiting from and contributing to the entrenched discriminatory system there. What do I mean? I mean businesses that operate in the West Bank, receive permits, access to infrastructure that are systematically denied to Palestinians. They're operating on or with land that was confiscated from Palestinians. They're providing jobs and revenue that goes into further entrenching these war crime settlements. And they also are operating in a system in which you have dual legal regimes, in which in the very same store that sells Ben & Jerry, if a Palestinian and an Israeli happen to work there, they're governed under different systems with different rights and protections. So the reality here is that businesses under the UN guiding principles have a duty not to contribute to human rights abuses. That's a decision Ben & Jerry's made. It's a principled distinction following their international legal obligations. These anti-boycott laws aren't just posing issues under the First Amendment. They're actually punishing companies that do the right thing by ending their complicity in human rights abuse. Human Rights Watch does business and human rights work around the world, and we are calling for companies that operate in settlements to do the same thing that companies who are involved in human rights abuses everywhere else do, which is end that complicity in rights abuse.
And so how exactly will this go down in Israel and the occupied territories? It won't take place for another year because of the contract that Ben & Jerry's has with the local distributor. Is that right, Omar?
That's correct. In essence, this decision says that they are not going to operate in settlements, and because their current distributor in Israel was not willing to agree to that condition, they will not be renewing their agreement with that distributor beyond the end of 2022. And to the extent that they continue to operate in Israel, they will ensure that they do so without operating in the occupied Palestinian territory, which of course includes occupied East Jerusalem, which the Israeli government has annexed, but remains occupied territory under international law, and where the Israeli government every day routinely, systematically is abusing the rights of Palestinians and systematically oppressing them.
Omar Shakir, we want to thank you for being with us, Israel and Palestine Director of Human Rights Watch, speaking to us from Amman, Jordan, and Logan Bayroff, Vice President of Communications for J Street. Next up, we go to Guatemala, where thousands took to the streets Thursday for a national strike demanding the resignation of right-wing President Alejandro Giammattei. Stay with us.
Soy la que pega en paredes las fotos de tantas desaparecidas. Soy la que pinta graffiti pidiendo justicia por todas sus amigas. Soy la que marcha con cara tapada y pechos valientes al aire. Yo soy la rabia y soy la ternura y no pertenezco a nadie. Traigo tambores, traigo clamores. A otra mujer hoy quitaron sus flores. No queremos más sufrir por mal de amores. No queremos niñas viviendo horrores. Nos queremos vivas. Otro feminicidio en las noticias. Nos queremos vivas. No daremos paz hasta que haya justicia. No daremos paz hasta que haya justicia. Donde otras sembraron semillas, hoy me han nacido flores. Tengo un jardín en el pecho donde cultivo todos mis amores. Donde otras sembraron semillas, hoy me han nacido flores. Tengo un jardín en el pecho donde cultivo todos mis amores. Soy la que exige aborto legal, soy la que acompaña en clandestinidad, soy la que apoya a su amiga cuando libremente ha elegido la maternidad, soy la que te ayuda sin preguntar nada, la que
Nos queremos vivas. We want to live, by Guatemalan feminist hip-hop artist Rebecca Lane. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We end today's show in Guatemala, where thousands took to the streets across the country Thursday for a massive national strike demanding the resignation of the right-wing president, Alejandro Giammattei, as well as other government officials. Major highways were blocked for hours as protesters marched through Guatemala City and in rural communities denouncing corruption, a worsening economic crisis, and the government's catastrophic mishandling of the pandemic. COVID-19 cases continue to skyrocket, with hospitals collapsing or on the verge. Meanwhile, less than 2% of the population of Guatemala has been vaccinated. The national strike was called by indigenous leaders who vowed they won't stop until there's radical change in Guatemala. This is indigenous rights defender Maria Calchol speaking Thursday from the region Alta Verapaz.
We have been resisting, and we will continue to resist against these injustices that have indigenous communities on our knees. We will continue to protect our dignity, what our ancestors inherited to us, what our grandmothers and grandfathers inherited to us, those who have been disappeared, persecuted, and assassinated for over 500 years.
And this is a student movement leader speaking from a roadblock in Guatemala City.
We must learn that we, the students, have to be part of the change. The urban region has to learn from collectivity, because individuality is only going to make our situation worse.
The national strike comes after recent mobilizations in response to the abrupt ousting last week of Guatemala's top anti-corruption prosecutor, Juan Francisco Sandoval, who was then forced to flee the country. He went over the border into El Salvador. The move also prompted the U.S. government to suspend some of its cooperation with Guatemala's Attorney General. Well, for more, we go to Guatemala City, where we're joined by Lucrecia Hernandez-Mack, Guatemalan physician and a member of the Guatemalan Congress with the political party Movimiento Semilla, that's the Seed movement. In 2016, she became the first woman to lead the Ministry of Health in Guatemala. She's the daughter of the late Guatemalan anthropologist Myrna Mack, who was assassinated by U.S.-backed security forces in the early 90s. And in Totonicapán, Guatemala, we're joined by Andrea Echu, Mayan Quiche leader, journalist, and human rights defender. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! We're going to start with Congressmember Mack. Can you talk about the significance of this mass protest and what has prompted it?
Well, we could say that this manifestations and demonstrations are sort of like the third chapter of our history in the fight against corruption that started in 2015. In 2015, we saw with the CICIG, the International Commission Against Impunity, we saw cases that revealed the participation of the vice president and the president involved in corruption. And we saw many demonstrations. We also had a strike, a national strike, that finally made the vice president and president to resign. Then we had a second chapter where basically the corrupt strike back, and we see how the public institutions start being taken over, like the Supreme Court of Justice, the Constitutional Court, the Electoral Court, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, the FECI, Juan Francisco Sandoval, is ousted by the Attorney General. And this is basically the third chapter where people here in Guatemala are just outraged, and we go back into the streets and demand for the President Giammattei and the Attorney General to resign also. And what we see is that we are just fed up with corruption. If we continue to go this way, we basically have no public institutions free of corruption. So this is the moment where we have united political parties with social movements, with ancestral authorities, communities, rural communities, citizens from the urban areas, students, motor taxis, think tanks, NGOs, activists, everybody is coming together to say no more. We don't want this anymore. And interestingly enough, this is a movement that has been led by ancestral authorities. So we are basically saying we don't want this anymore.
I want to bring Andrea Ishu into the conversation. Maya Quiche, leader, journalist, human rights defender. You're in Western Guatemala. This was an indigenous-led mass protest. Can you talk about what's happening in your area, the significance of the indigenous leadership, and particularly describe the Guatemalan blockades, indigenous people taking to the streets and blocking the highways?
Hello, thank you for this space. I think it's really important to say that, we always say it, that indigenous peoples have been mobilizing for more than 529 years against colonialism, corruption, and the pillage of our ancestral lands. The indigenous government of Totonicapán, where I came from, decided to call for these big mobilizations and to call to this national strike, reunited with other indigenous governments from all over the country, because we are tired how in the midst of the pandemic, the Guatemala government are stealing the money from the vaccines and militarizes the country. The anti-corruption prosecutor is dismissed without justification, and the prosecutor was investigating a recent meeting between the President Alejandro Yamatei, who received in recent weeks investors related to nickel mining companies that operate illegally in Guatemala and that are violating the rights of the Maya Quechí communities that lives in the region of the El Estorizabal, an area of exploitation, of monocultures, of mining, and that have lived very, very hard the effects of the pandemic and the climate crisis. So a lot of indigenous communities have been militarized during the pandemic. We haven't received attention and social programs during pandemic, and especially in the Quechí area, the voices of the women, as Maria Caala, that you heard at the beginning, is telling how a lot of companies is operating in their lands without consultation and consent from the communities. So we see with preoccupation how the president is reuniting with these land investors, with these mining contractors, a few months before a consultation is going to be done in El Estor, because the communities needs to give their opinion about the mining operation in the area. So during the pandemic, as I said, the country was militarized. There was a multiple violent evictions where a lot of indigenous communities were expelled from their lands, from their communities. So it's suspicious, this kind of meetings that the special prosecutor anti-corruption was investigating against the president when he was removed from his position. So as indigenous peoples, we're always been organizing against the exploitation of the land, the defense of the water, the defense of the territories, and because we're tired that this state that is very well administrated by economical elites, military, and drug traffickers are just denying our access for a life in dignity. So when the people says that indigenous communities are blocking the roads, we said no. We are mobilizing for a life in dignity where we can have deep political changes in the way that our country is organized, because the ones that have been blocking the road for develop and life in dignity are the crime elites that refuses to make changes and that are cooptating Guatemalan state.
Lucrecia Hernandez-Mack in Guatemala City, you are in Congress. For people outside Guatemala who may not be familiar with the term, the Pacto de Corruptos, the corrupt pact, talking about a group of business people, political leaders. Well, if you could describe what they are and their ascendancy now, also particularly in Congress, and what it means for human rights all over Guatemala.
Yes, the Pacto de Corruptos was very visible when in Congress there was an attempt to protect the president, Jimmy Morales, back in 2017. And what we see is that this is the alignment of economic elite, politicians, even drug traffickers here in Guatemala as well that have links to politicians. We also see, public authorities involved. And what has happened is that they have taken over public institutions in order to protect themselves from justice, guarantee their impunity. And so they have taken basically, like I said, the Electoral Court, the Supreme Court of Justice, the Constitutional Court. They are going after the Human Rights Ombudsman. And we see that they have also used the public institutions to pursue and, independent judges, political opposition, journalists, civil society leaders, activists with various actions, like smear campaigns, troll factories, threats, harassments, criminal complaints or accusations. And they are basically undermining the state, the government. They are using the state and the public institutions for their own benefit. And they're basically undermining the democracy and the justice system. So this is what has the people fed up, because we can no longer tolerate any more advance of these pacto de corruptos, the pact of the corrupt.
Let me ask Andrea about the demands, the indigenous demands for Guatemalan government to establish a plurinational state. What does that mean?
Well, the Mayan, Xinca and Garifuna indigenous authorities propose a route to a new political pact, because we know that it's not going to be easy. We wait to build a plurinational popular assembly, a constitutional assembly, because it's really important and it's really urgent to transform from the roots the political pact that has denied the very existence of indigenous authorities or ways of living and organizing, the ways that we administrate our lands. So we are saying that that needs to change, that we need a country where the people can live in dignity and in respect. And that means, sitting down and speaking with the politicians, sitting down and speaking with the people organized all over Guatemala. So we know that it's going to be a path. It's going to be a long way to go to. But also it's an urgent thing that we need to keep doing. And because the crisis that we're living the conditions that we live in are ugly.
And Lucretia Mack, in this last minute, you are the first woman Minister of Health of Guatemala before you became a Congress member. Describe the COVID situation right now.
What we're seeing right now is the overlapping of the political crisis with the economic crisis and the health crisis. And the health crisis is not only a problem with the vaccines, with the vaccination. Like you said, we have less than 2% of our population vaccinated. But right now, we are in the third wave. So we are seeing record figures of cases and deaths from COVID-19. And right now, hospitals, public and private, are just full. They are saturated. The health workers are just burned out. And that's why we also saw health workers yesterday participating and, joining and supporting the national strike. So we are, and the government is very reluctant and resisting to take measures in order to control the pandemic.
Well, I want to thank you both for being with us. We'll continue to follow the situation. Lucrecia Hernandez Mack, member of the Guatemalan Congress, first woman health minister of Guatemala before she was a Congress member, and Andrea Ichu, Maya Quiche leader, journalist and human rights defender, joining us from Western Guatemala. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us. Stay safe.